Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, I'm David Myers, host of Then and Now. The LA wildfires of early 2025 had a devastating effect on the lives of thousands of residents of Southern California, especially in Pacific Palisades and Altadena. Then and Now is committed to telling the stories of these communities and the impact of the fires upon them through a wide variety of perspectives. Today, we sit down to talk with Amy Green, principal of Silver Lake Conservation and one of LA's most experienced and skilled historical conservators. Amy's work in saving intricately crafted tiles from the early 20th century from fire-ravaged homes in Altadena has been written up in both the Los Angeles and New York Times. In this episode of Then and Now, which is co-sponsored by the LA History Collaborative, Amy tells us how she got into the work of architectural and historical conservation, what her work entails, and how she understands the significance of the tiles to Altadena and Southern California more generally. Welcome to Then and Now, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So tell us how you got into the business of conservation.
I, for many years, was a potter or a ceramic artist. From the time I was 12, all through college and after, it was the thing I enjoyed doing the most. I tried to make a living selling artwork and teaching. It was a bit of a struggle. And when I came to Los Angeles with my husband, I took an unpaid internship in a private conservation studio and just felt completely in love with the field.
Why was that?
Because I had much more patience for repairing things than for making things. I loved that it wasn't just one material. I then was able to work on other materials like metals and other forms of masonry. So it was fun to see the differences and the similarities between the materials. It's very collaborative. When I first imagined conservation, I had this thought about just gluing things together all by myself, but in fact, you're always working with not only people who do what you do, but people who are in adjacent fields. It is art adjacent, which is a very nice place to be. No pressure to make
What exactly are the skills that you think are necessary to do this work?
I think both science, it's one of those things that combines science with hand skills and color and, the hand skills, color, all of the sort of art skills you imagine if you're a painter or a sculptor, as well as the science of working on materials. And there is a sensibility to the field that I really appreciate, that we are just a stop along the way. We are not, we're not interpreting objects, we are preserving them. We are, if we're working on contemporary sculpture or artwork, we're very conscious of the intent of the artist. And so it combines so many things that I liked.
So this is interesting in terms of your actual professional mission, which is not to reinterpret that which you're working on. Is it to bring it back to its exact previous state?
No, actually, that's one of the things, the difference between restoration. You'll hear people talk about restoration, and I always bridle a little bit at that term, because to me that it implies making something look new again. Mm-hmm. And as I've said many times, particularly recently, we do not disguise the patina of age. That is not our job. In fact, it's part of the history of this, whether it's artwork or some sort of material culture, like tile or architecture. We are not pretending it's new. We're not trying to make it look new. We're trying to keep it healthy and stable and pass it along to the next generation.
In an inescapably altered state.
Yes, it is. Nothing is perfectly stable. There's very little that's completely inert. Some materials more than others, but it. I always say this. I consider conservators the medical we're like the medical practitioners of the art world. We're the doctors of the art world. We perform emergency care. We perform well health care. We sort of help things stay stable without altering them in ways that can't be undone. Reversibility is a big part of, you hear it often with conservators, it's a big part of what we do. We assume people will get smarter, that materials, repair materials may improve over time. They definitely do. And so we are always working from the point of view of this can be undone. It's a little trickier with architecture because there you have health and human safety. You want things to hold up.
And what would the end result be of a new technology that was an advancement over what we have today?
Repair materials that last longer, but that don't compromise what's around them. Mm-hmm. Mostly that. I mean, that's sort of what I dream of, like the perfect mortar and paint that will look like tile, but will not reveal itself quite so quickly, like most things do when you put two different materials next to each other.
Mm. What have been some of the most interesting projects you've worked on over the course of your distinguished career?
There have been so many. The first one I really loved was repairing Malibu tile tables. They were things that were I don't know if you've ever been to Adamson House out in Malibu, but it was a home built by the proprietors, the founders of Malibu Tile. And they are these very beautiful tiles that were around only for 6 years. The factory burned down, I think, in 32 maybe, and they never started up again. And I had to teach myself how to make these tiles. And that was a really satisfying thing to do. And it combined everything I loved. So I was both working in clay and figuring out the science of the materials that were involved in the processes, and then being able to reproduce them credibly so that I could use them to replace missing tiles on the tables I was working on. That was a long time ago. I would definitely farm out that part of it, but there was something about having the time and the energy and the patience to follow something through like that. So that's a high point.
How many tiles did you use?
Like less than 20. I mean, it was like but I had to make a lot I had to teach myself how to do something called cuero seca, which is a dry line. So it's like a linseed oil with stain and with like ilmenite or like black iron oxide that would create a resist for the patterns. So that, I mean, it was fun. It was, I'm firing things in my kiln and, holding them up next to the original tiles and trying to get as close as possible. Again, I would never do that again. If I need tiles made, I go to someone who makes tiles at this point. But that was satisfying. Recently, we were part of working on the historic lobby at the Herald Examiner building on Broadway in LA. And although it was a little out of my comfort zone, we were working on a lot of decorative painted surfaces. It was really wonderful to sort of clean and examine the work by Julia Morgan and do it from the ceiling on down to the floor. It was, just feeling very intimate. We were the project conservators at the observatory. Again, we were able to sort of really get to know every square inch of that building. I stood on top of the dome over the coelostat and at the very top of the building. So that was kind of great. I mean, there's been a lot of things in South LA, working at public libraries on public artworks that need help of some sort. Those are satisfying as well. Getting to work with certain artists. There's an artist I love named Robin Strayhorn. I've sort of worked with her on public art projects. That is very satisfying. Wandering into celebrity homes after I signed an NDA and sort of like working on their artwork or dealing with a tile emergency. Well, some I can't say, and I don't know that I necessarily, even ones where I haven't signed an NDA. I've met Sylvester Stallone. I won't tell you what he had in his backyard, but it was a lot of fun. And we did take a selfie, which was very cute. He was very pleasant. So yeah, just getting around LA, getting around the city and into neighborhoods I otherwise wouldn't know nearly as well. It's such a, I don't know, it feels unbelievably lucky to be able to spend weeks at a time somewhere, getting to know the neighborhoods. And so
let's turn to a more sober subject, which is the LA wildfires of early 2025. You have visited both major burn zones in Pacific Palisades and Altadena. Can you tell us what you saw, what you have seen through your lenses?
Well, the first place we went was the Palisades, because we had a client in need, whose house had survived. He needed us to look at some of his outdoor work. There are several things. One is the whole commercial area in the Palisades is just torn through. This is an area I know fairly well. The Bank of America was completely gone. The Gelson's was gone. There are burnt out cars in all of the driveways. It's a very strange just to see sort of the rusted out structure and frame or the rubble. They look like bombs went off. And I think in fact, that's sort of what happened. You had these very heavy embers being carried by the winds, and they were getting pulled into or thrown into, sort of literally tossed through windows of homes. And then it was probably sending off, gas explosions. And so it looks like a war zone. And then you'll see a whole one side of the street where everything's completely gone, and then the other side of the street where it doesn't look touched. It's shocking, and you start looking around and then you stop because it feels wrong, like you're staring at other people's tragedies. Right. Yeah, it does. It starts to feel voyeuristic. Mm-hmm. Altadena was it feels different. For one thing, it's a much more varied, socioeconomically, it's much more varied. And the first house that I got called into I was called by a young man, he and his wife. It was their first home in Altadena. It was very modest, and the only thing that survived were their tiles. And he had gotten my name from that Tile Heritage Foundation, who I know very well. I helped him I talked him through saving his tiles. He was able to do it himself. And it just, his street was just wiped out. I went over just to sort of, talk to him, and it looks like bombs have dropped in these areas. And that's true throughout Altadena. In Altadena, I've gone from these very modest homes to a 100-year-old Myron Hunt Wallace Neff home. And they all have these tiles, which I find interesting on many levels. One is that it crossed all sorts of socioeconomic bounds. You had them in these 1,200 square foot workers' homes, and then you have it in a Wallace Neff, Myron Hunt home.
Is that unique to Altadena in your experience, the ubiquity of tiles?
No, I think it's unique to these particular. It's the arts and crafts tiles. So it's Ernest Batchelder and it's Claycraft. These businesses that were around in the early 20th century.
Tell us about Ernest Batchelder and Claycraft.
Well, Ernest Batchelder. So the definitive books about Ernest Batchelder are by Robert Winter, who was an architectural historian at Occidental College. And he actually lived in Batchelder's house up until he died, and I got to visit him there. Ernest Batchelder was a brilliant salesman. The tiles that he made are, they really fit the time and the taste, particularly for arts and crafts homes. I've seen them in green houses. I've seen them all over. I've gotten calls from Pittsburgh about Batchelder installations, and New York, about Batchelder installations. So he knew what he was doing, and he had multiple factories going at his height. And
this is the early 20th century.
Early 20th century arts and crafts. So I would say, like, for him, late teens all through the 20s. He has some very iconic installations. Ernest Batchelder, he has the Chocolate Shop, which is in a 7-story building on 6th and Broadway in the Broadway district, which was made to sell chocolates, basically. And it's an entire room. If you look it up, you'll see some of it's mostly intact. It's somebody just purchased the building recently, and hopefully it won't get taken apart. But this was a significant and well-known installation. There's a lot of lore about it. He did the interior of the Fine Arts Building on 7th where is it? It's close to the old Robinson May building, which is an entire lobby of this incredibly beautiful 1920s building. If you ever have, you can walk into it. It's called the Fine Arts Building. We recently were called in by the Jonathan Club because they were doing a renovation of their restaurant on the 13th floor, and they pulled off some drywall and found bachelor tiles. They didn't know what they had. Their construction manager had met us at the Herald Examiner building. He called us and said, I think there's something here you guys need to look at. They don't know what it is. And Linnea and I just went in and said, these are bachelor, and these are incredibly valuable now. So we need to do something about them. And so we did the repairs, I think on 3 or 4 columns, and they left, so they're everywhere.
And Claycraft
was a competitor. They looked very similar to Batchelder. They didn't have quite the same national, profile, but they're very beautiful. I don't know. I think Claycraft, also went out of business in the 30s. There was just a heyday for tile in Southern California between the 10s, the early part of the 20th century that went right through the war, basically. And
if you were to map the presence of tile-heavy homes, Batchelder and otherwise, what would that map look like in Southern California? Altadena as a major center of gravity.
Pasadena has a huge concentration. We've done much more work before this when we were just repairing people's fireplaces. A lot of it was in Pasadena. There were some mid-city Los Angeles. I was working on a Claycraft fireplace in mid-city when the fires happened. So they were definitely around. I haven't really seen very many in Santa Monica where I live, but I do have a client with a home in Santa Monica that was built in the 20s that has a beautiful fireplace. But I would say they're pretty concentrated in Pasadena. That's where he lived. That's where many of them were produced. But as he became more popular, he produced them in more areas. And in Gladding McBean, which is a architectural terracotta tile producer that are now up in Lincoln, California, they were producing Batchelder for Batchelder at some point because he was getting so much business that he was subbing out some of it to other manufacturers. So he really was, the guy.
Mm-hmm. And in aesthetic terms, what makes a Batchelder a Batchelder? What was distinctive about it?
It's a very good question because they're very, very, I keep saying arts and crafts. They're very earthy. They're low fire, which means that they're in the 1600 to 1800 range for firing temperature. They don't have a lot of glossy glazes on them. They tend to decorate with slip, which is liquid clay that's got oxides or stains in them to give them some color. So they're very flat and they're very earthy, and they tend to be in a very earthy palette of like umbers and sometimes blues and greens, but mostly the sort of browns. They fit the arts and crafts style. You don't see them as much in the other architectural styles. You wouldn't see them as much in like a Spanish. You probably get something a little bit more colorful, Mission, Revival, or Spanish. So yeah, they're very much in the arts and crafts.
So these tiles have come to the attention of both local and national media. There have been major stories in the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times about the Save the Tiles project. So can you tell us about that and how you got involved?
So Eric Garland and Stanley Zucker are the co-founders of Save the Tiles, which is a nonprofit that popped up right after the fires. Eric Garland and his daughter live in Pasadena, or sort of in the Pasadena-Altadena area. Their house survived, but his daughter noticed that one of the things that had survived in these houses that had burned down were the fireplaces and the surrounds. And she said, we need to do something about it. And he and Stanley decided that they were going to figure out, they were going to make this happen. And so they found me we've been working on Batchelder tiles for more than 20 years, so it wasn't hard. I think Pasadena Heritage or the Pasadena History Museum, we've done work for them, and Tile Heritage would all have given them our name. And that's how I got involved. And I've also been getting calls just from other people who are not through Save the Tile, but who heard my name or heard our name. So initially, mostly the nicest thing I did initially was give them our mason to work with directly. He's not in a position to volunteer his time, and so that's the money that they're raising is to pay their masons at this point.
This is someone with whom you regularly work?
We work, yeah, I would say he works close to half time for us. He's actually on our payroll. We hire him project by project, but we want to make sure that his workman's comp is covered and all of that. And so he works directly for us. So he's been pretty busy taking down, rescuing tiles. He and another sub that we work with, Brandon, it's Tom Carling and Brandon Fong. So there are, I think, several teams now of masons who just who go out and remove them and try to map them as best they can. So in theory, they can go back in a similar order or similar order to how they were originally. We have gone to help on the weekends. We will go and help teach them how to wrap things properly, how to organize them. And this is all part of phase one. Phase one is getting the tiles off before the Army Corps of Engineers shows up.
Right. So there's a kind of race against time, as I understand it. They're both looters, and they're...
there's a lot of talk about looters.
Okay,
I keep hearing talk about looters.
Yep.
I know. I don't know how true that part is. I really don't, because I think it's true that in the Palisades there was more protection because you can't get there without a pass. But I also don't think that people fully understood the value of these tiles until Save the Tiles started, saying, "Hey, look at these." So again,
but you're
I don't
racing
know.
against the Army Corps of
You're
Engineers.
racing against the Army Corps of Engineers more than anything. If you go to Altadena, it doesn't invite looting. Even that, some of these things are 2 stories up, so you need scaffolding to reach them, or you have to pry them, and you have to stand in a lot of rubble. So I feel like those are stories that people, I don't know.
Exaggeration.
A little bit. It's perceived crime versus actual crime.
Right.
I'm sure there have been some that have stolen.
Right.
I've heard that, but I don't know if it's that many. So really, yes, as you said, we're sort of working against Army Corps of Engineers. They're not going to carefully dismantle the tiles. They're just going to come back through. And so the job right now is to get them out. And then once they're out, the long-term hope is that they go back to the owners, that it's something that they'll be able to use in a new home, that it's, something that's sort of, it's a bit of a bridge from what was lost to,
so can you
to the next thing
through like the process from the first identification to what's your last touch? Somebody identifies that there are tiles in a damaged home. You find out. How do you find out? What happens from that point forward?
There've been people surveying. That's actually a part of Save the Tiles, and mostly volunteers have gone around and surveyed, and I think they've come up with about 200 homes that had tiles that survived. And then they needed to get permission from the owners. You can't just walk onto the property and take them without explicit permission from the owner. And this at the beginning, there were real questions about who could go on, and would you go on and hire somebody, or you're going to lose your opportunity to use this free debris removal that was being offered by the Army Corps of Engineers. So the very first part of it was just organizing it and making sure that we understood where everything was, and that the owners had given permission so that you could walk onto the property and remove them. And once they're removed and boxed up, they're temporarily stored right now at Eric Garland, who's the co-founder of Save the Tile. And ultimately, they're going to be moved to a more long-term storage facility, either in Arcadia or Harbor City. The county has also possibly offered an opportunity, a space to store things, while everything gets figured out. So this is the first part. The second part, there's plenty of time. The first part is just getting them out safely as quickly as possible. And then once they're out and you know exactly where they came from and who they belong to, the next piece of it will be cleaning, which is basically what it sounds like. You're cleaning tiles. It's not that complicated. For us, it's gentle detergent, distilled water, some solvents to degrease the surfaces. If they're broken, they get readhered. using an adhesive, of course, that's reversible because, we can hope that in the future.
Reversibility is always a criterion.
It's always for non-structural finishes like this one. Absolutely. Losses in the tiles, we compensate using some sort of inert reversible patching mortar. And then the losses get painted or toned to mimic what's surrounding them, both in color and sheen. And then we often, and we have done this for years, encourage people to wax their tiles. If they're going to be up around a fireplace, the wax will provide a protective sort of a sacrificial coating that will break down naturally, can be reapplied as necessary. And I frankly think it makes them look better. It gives them a nice sheen. Sort of that's our little thing. 30 years from now, they'll be laughing at us. Then
because
next
of the
3
technology.
generations, they'll be like, "Oh my God, you hadn't invented, because we haven't invented that perfect, sacrificial coating."
Now, put on your futurist hat. What does that look like? What will exist in 30 years?
Oh, that's a good question. Really green, environmentally green materials across the board for everything. There's a lot of research or thought right now about lime plaster, which is something that's been used long ago and is a much more environmentally friendly way to go. So I imagine, just really environmentally friendly materials. I work with far too many solvents at this point that make me a little uncomfortable. And so, yeah, I think that's what I hope for, what the young people are working on for us. Green stuff.
Green stuff.
Yeah.
LA, Southern California, is the site of cultural convergences, as a well-known historian has put it, namely your partner, Steve Aaron.
Yes.
Can you say something about the tile culture in LA as a site of convergence?
Yes. In fact, I think I was quoted in the LA Times talking about this, that this is both because of the raw materials and because of the number of different cultures that exist in Southern California, you have this wonderful convergence of aesthetic variation, and always in LA, this sort of willingness to try something new and different. So you have this really wonderful variety. When I went to Spain, I could see the influences on tiles that I had seen in San Diego. It's just, it's very rich. The tile history is very rich here in Southern California. Some of it is the clay. Malibu tile, for example, started because there was a big clay deposit right there in Malibu discovered. And, that is what this family chose to do, that owned most of Malibu at that time. And
there's such a rich tile culture in Mexico, too.
There is. And so some of that's come up from the South and Europe as well. When you Delft and Mallorca tiles, faience, that's all European, Spanish. So yes, it's definitely benefited, like many things in Los Angeles, from having lots of different people from lots of different places sharing their knowledge and their aesthetics. And
is there a native tile culture that
actually, that's funny. My favorite subcontractor to work with who makes tiles, that's the name of her company, Native Tile. She's in Torrance, and she does reproductions of, among others, Malibu tile. I think that is what it is. I mean, I think of Malibu tile as a native tile culture. I think of Batchelder as a native tile culture. They're completely different, but they are both absolutely California. Even though you can see that they draw from all kinds of influences, there's something specifically Southern California about the final product, about the outcome.
So you're from the East Coast.
I am. Well, I'm from Buffalo, New York. My in-laws don't really think of that as the East Coast. But I think you understand.
Some people would call that upstate New York.
Exactly. Some people would call it Canada. So
you have kind of the outsider's angle of observation on Southern California. In terms of what you do, what does Southern California look like? I mean, with a sort of one step back and kind of with a measure of distance, what does Southern California look like to you professionally, as opposed to other sites around the country? What does it offer? What are its challenges?
Well, it offers a lot. I mean, there's a lot here. Given that we at Silver Lake Conservation, we toggle back and forth between sculpture and architecture, there's a lot of art here. There's a lot of public art here, but there's just also a rich culture. And architecturally, it also offers a lot, because unlike other places that I've lived, there's a lot of variation in style and approach, although there are certain materials that are very vernacular, and tile is one of them. So, I mean, I think a lot of opportunity. There's just a lot of opportunity here. There are a lot of people who do what I do here, which should in theory make us nervous for competition, but in fact, we have these wonderful colleagues and a wonderful community, and we share technicians and we share materials. I came to California, Southern California, very reluctantly. I didn't think this would be a nice place to raise my kids. I didn't think it would be a nice place to live, and I was very wrong about that. It's incredibly interesting and varied, and the weather's kind of great.
I want to go back to the beginning as we wrap this fascinating conversation up, and ask you, why do you do what you do?
That's a good question, because I really like it. Because particularly right now with the fires and with the salvaging of the tiles, I actually feel like I'm doing something good. It's not just fancy art for fancy people. It's actually, helping people, in a sense, grieve, and offering them some hope, because there was something that was able to be salvaged from all of this. There was some bridge between what was lost and what is coming up. And one of the things, just as a potter, that really fascinated me was that the fires themselves, in some cases, made the tiles stronger, because it sent them up to a slightly higher temperature, so they fused the particle. And I love that I know that, and I love that I get to use that in my work. So there are a lot of things I love about what I do. Getting to touch art, and sometimes very expensive art, getting to, sort of get a glimpse of how lots of different people live,
and play a role in the important work of reconstruction that needs to be done after this devastating natural disaster.
I hope we're smart about it. I hope we learn from this. I really do. I always hope that about everything. I hope we can learn from this. And maybe build a little smarter. Maybe people can. I've said this many times. The one thing I can take away from all of this, having been in and out of these areas, is how nice people are to each other sometimes when things are really awful. That people step up and they're really kind at their best. Sometimes, it brings out the best. It can also bring out the worst, obviously. But for the most part, in all of this, I've really seen people behave so well. World Central Kitchen is in both of these sites every day, and they've been feeding our masons. I love that. They're just, it gives me hope a little bit.
In moments of radical devastation, we need more radical kindness, and you're seeing
exactly.
Well, Amy Green, conservator extraordinaire, thank you for all the work you do in preserving the great cultural treasures of Southern California, and for making time out of your busy schedule to be with us on Then and Now.
Well, I'm always happy to talk to you, and I look forward to seeing you off camera, off the radio. Bye, David.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.